Hello, good job, Ed. How was your day today?
This one is you want to put it in the oven?
Hey, nice. Oh,
Nice entrance.
yes, very nice.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to see you.
No? Well, they're not showing anything yet, but I'll move it for you if you want.
He will.
Yeah. Hold on. I'm going to move this for you. Let me move it and I'll show you where you need to be.
Nobody can see me.
There you go. Right
Yeah,
here.
that's lovely.
How about
Thank you. That's nice.
You just, you here?
Amin, ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, be'emuna shelema, be'vias HaMoshiach, be'vias HaMoshiach, ani ma'amin.
Thank you very much. Judah and Liv from the Klezmer Barrows of Santa Fe. Ani ma'amin. The Holocaust, a word of such magnitude that it cannot be grasped. Horrific experiences that cannot be fathomed. Unbelievable, incomprehensible, incomparable. The most horrific genocide the human race has known. Yet it took place just one generation ago. We shudder to hear the stories of the Holocaust. It's painful. But we must listen lest we forget. We must listen to take lessons. Lessons in what we should not do and lessons in how to cope, survive, and triumph over evil. Good afternoon. My name is Rabbi Berel Levertov, co-director of the Santa Fe Jewish Center Chabad. Learning the lessons of the Holocaust is an incredible motivator for life, hopefully inspiring us to shine more goodness and kindness into the world. Some of you have read the diary of Anne Frank, but her diary ends before she experiences the hardest and darkest part of the Holocaust, the concentration camps. Her friend, our speaker, continues where she left off. What you will hear today is a true story, a heartbreaking story. When hearing these stories, we are always plagued by the question, how can this have taken place in the free world? Why didn't anyone stop them? The travesty of the Holocaust was not created in a vacuum. It happened because the world allowed it and did not stop them. Jews were desperately trying to escape Nazi Germany, but the world closed its doors and wouldn't accept them. Anti-Semitism was rampant around the world, and they stood by and watched until it was too late. Don't allow it to happen again. Stand up for hate, against hate, stand up against anti-Semitism, and remember to bring more good into the world. Joshua Medina is a star student and graduate of Chabad Hebrew School. He's a proud Jewish teen who had his bar mitzvah at the Santa Fe Jewish Center Chabad. He recently trained to be a docent for the traveling Anne Frank exhibit here in Santa Fe, and will be introducing our speaker, Midor Lidor, from generation to generation. Please welcome Joshua Medina.
Good afternoon, everyone. In 1939, Nazi Germany occupied Lodz, Poland, and in 1940 established a ghetto within the northeastern section of Lodz. Around 160,000 Jews, more than a third of the city's population, were forced into a small area of the city. 8-year-old Michael Roth was amongst those forced to live within the ghetto with his family while their movement was severely restricted. In 1944, the Nazis deported the surviving 3,000 Jews from the Lodz ghetto to Auschwitz concentration camp. 12-year-old Michael Roth was amongst them. Although most children who arrived at the camps were exterminated, miraculously, Michael's of the few that survived. Being proud of having been raised in a Jewish household and representing my grandfather's legacy is one of the most important parts of who I am as a person today. I'm here today because Michael Roth survived. He was my late grandfather. I know he'd be proud that I'm growing up as a proud Jew within my community, had my bar mitzvah at Chabad, and continue practicing my religion. And that's why it's such an honor and means so much to me personally to share the stage with another survivor from the very same camp as my grandfather, Mrs. Eva Schloss. Mrs. Eva Schloss of London, UK is the stepsister and childhood friend of Anne Frank. Mrs. Schloss is a trustee of the Anne Frank Educational Trust, author of 3 books, and the subject of James Still's play, And Then They Came for Me, Remembering the World of Anne Frank. Like her stepsister, Eva went into hiding in Holland until she, along with her family, was betrayed, captured, and sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. Her story continues where Anne's left off. Since 1985, Eva Schloss has devoted herself to Holocaust education and global peace. She's recounted her wartime experiences in more than 1,000 speaking engagements. In 1999, Eva signed the Anne Frank Peace Declaration, along with United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan and the niece of Raoul Wallenberg, a legendary figure who rescued thousands of Jews in Budapest. Eva joins many courageous individuals who work tirelessly to end the violence and bigotry plaguing our world. Her story is sensational and difficult to imagine. Yet, Eva Schloss's insightful message reminds us that life is precious and fragile. The creative spirit is stronger than fear. The power of good is immeasurable, and that love makes a difference. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mrs. Eva Schloss.
Thank you, thank you.
Let's start at the beginning of this story because it starts very early, even though you were very young at the time. You remember the Germans marching into Austria, which is where you grew up.
Yes, very well. I remember that very, very well. I came really from Austria, a beautiful city, a lovely country. We had a big extended family, and life seemed very, very good. But it didn't last very long, because in 1938, without being invited to come into Austria, one day the Nazis, in March 1938, the Nazis just marched in and occupied the country. We were, of course, a Jewish family, and our non-Jewish friends stood in the streets with Heil Hitler salute. Suddenly they all had swastika flags waving and welcoming Hitler. My brother, the next day, my brother, who was 12 years old, came home from school, and he looked terrible. His clothes were torn, his face was full of blood, and when my parents questioned him, he said, "My own friends did that, and the teachers just watched it happening, to be attacked." My best friend was actually a Catholic little girl, and on the way home from school, I usually stopped there to do a little bit of game, whatever, playing. But again, the next day after the invasion, I went again playing there. And when the mother saw me, I could see she looked very, very cross at me. And she opened the door, and said, "We never want to see you here again," and slammed the door in my face. I went home crying. I said to my mother, "I don't understand. We didn't have a quarrel." And my mother said, "Well, for Jewish people, life is going to be from now on very, very difficult."
It was in Holland that you met Anne Frank, who was a friend of a friend. Your brother was a good friend with her older sister. We know her from the book, but that's limited. What was she like, knowing her as a friend?
We eventually, in 1940, moved to Amsterdam. Very lucky that was. And the Dutch were actually very welcoming. I felt right at home immediately. And one day, a little girl came to me, introduced herself very politely, and said her name is Anne Frank. And we became friends when she realized I came from Germany, from Austria, and couldn't speak Dutch very well. She took me up to her apartment, and I met her whole family. So we were just 3 months there, and the Nazis just invaded that country.
And they made Jews wear yellow stars, and that was very strictly enforced.
Well, at first when they came in, they didn't want to make enemies of the Dutch population. So things went, nothing really happened for the first few months. And we thought, well, perhaps they don't want to do this in occupied countries. But of course, it did happen. But only very slowly measures against Jewish people started to be in the radio or in newspapers, or even big posters were put out. Like you said, we had to wear a Jewish star, meaning that when you walked in the street and Nazi and SS passed you, he was in a bad mood or he didn't like your expression, he could just arrest you. So all kind of difficulties were put in our way. We were not on the public transport. Then we had to hand in our bicycles. We were not allowed to go to theaters or do anything really. We had to be in early in the morning. There was a curfew for Jewish people, and it was controlled because you were a star. And if you would say, "Well, I'm not wearing the star," you had as well an ID card. And if you were stopped in the street and showed your ID card and you were a Jew and you didn't have your star, you were arrested immediately. By that time in 1942, Hitler actually had occupied already the whole of Europe. And in all those countries he was deporting Jewish people. And everywhere people, of course, as you can imagine, hated to be occupied by the Nazis. They were second class. The local population became second-class citizens. So there was a big movement called the Resistance. They helped Jewish people who had to go into hiding to find good homes. Very often, with homes where the people were resistance workers. And so my father explained me that he didn't find their apartments in Holland are quite small, and he said he couldn't find a family who was taking in 4 people, so he had to split us up. He said, "I will go with my mother, and Hans will go with him." And I started crying because I was very attached to my brother, and my father didn't want to be separated. And my father explained, if we're in 2 different places, the chance that 2 of us will survive is bigger. Survive. So I think this was the first time that I realized it might be a matter of life and death.
And you were 13 years old.
I was 13 years old.
Let's talk about that. I think one of the misapprehensions people are under is that no one knew until after the war, until Ed Murrow gets to Buchenwald, about the concentration camps and the death camps. Yet you were able to hear BBC broadcasts that talked about extermination camps. What did you know when you were in hiding and when you were boarding that train about the camps?
Well, all the occupied countries were, of course, not allowed to listen to foreign BBC radio. And the BBC sent broadcast out to all the occupied countries, and it always told how the war was going, but as well always it mentioned the 300 death camps in Germany and Poland where Jewish people were systematically being gassed. There was no secret whatsoever. I really thought, we all thought, that will be the end of our lives.
What was it like on the train? What were the conditions like?
The train is, of course, I'm sure most of you have seen that. It's, of course, not an ordinary train where people have benches and windows. It was, I call it a container wagon, because that's what it was, metal, or a cattle truck where you put cattle in, metal, just a big sliding door in the front. They put 2 buckets in, one with clean water, the other one to use for toilets, open bucket, for about 70, 80 people. Once a day, the doors were slit open and chunks of bread was thrown in, like you would feed wild animals. The bucket, you can imagine, were overflowing, and that was when all over the place, and only after 24 hours we got a clean bucket. So the stench, it was just terrible. So eventually the train stopped and we realized we were in Auschwitz. And we knew Auschwitz was the biggest death camp amongst the many, many, many camps in Poland. But so we jumped down from the train and men and women were separated. And you can imagine what a scene that was, to say goodbye to your father, or wives to their sons or husband. And it is when my father took me by the hands and said, God will protect you, because he realized he has no power anymore.
A hat and a long coat probably saved your life.
Well, definitely. While we were in Westerbork this week, which I didn't realize, somebody, because I still had, well, we all had the clothes we were arrested in, somebody gave my mother a hat and coat. And in Auschwitz, my mother, I don't know why, she gave it to me. And I didn't want to wear it because it was very hot and I'd never worn a hat. And it was a big hat like the Rabbi wears. and so when the men had marched away, there was rows of 5. Everything was always rows of 5, or this way or this way. So we stood this way, and you might have heard the name Mengele. He was the camp doctor. He was around 40 years old, a proper medical man, but he wasn't there to keep us healthy. He was there to decide who was going to die or who was going to live. So he looked at you just a fraction of a second and decided this side or this side. And this hat saved my life because he didn't realize how young I was. So many people, 17, 16, 18 girls who were perhaps small and looked very pale, went to the wrong side. And eventually we marched into the camp. And this was, of course, the first terrible shock to us. We had to undress completely naked, put our clothes on the floor, and a lot of young Nazi men between 20 and 30 were laughing at our embarrassment and poking their guns at us, how we protected our private parts. So, you know, and we were actually in shock. The next thing, we had to go in front of a table, naked of course, and tell them which country we came, because from the whole of Europe, Jewish people were taken to those camps. Had to give where we came from, what profession, what age, and as well what you could do in future, you know, how to help the Nazis with their war. Stupid question as well. And while this was going on, they told us, forget you are a human being, you're just like cattle, we are going to give you a tattoo on your arm, and if ever we want you, you're going to be called out by the number, not by your name. And while this was going on, they told us that the people who went the other direction were told to go into a shower. And then they laughed very loud and, as if it was the most funny thing in the world. And then they told us again with so much pleasure that, but it wasn't a shower because gas came out of the pipes. And within 5, 10, 15 minutes, all your family was killed. So you can imagine how a mother felt who had just been, had to hand over her little baby or her toddler. So people started to cry, of course. Then all our hair was shaved, not properly shaved, but with big scissors, just very roughly. And then we were let out, and still naked. And there were a huge heap. We passed a huge heap, a mountain of clothes. And we were thrown one garment. And the next heap were shoes, 2 shoes. Of course, never anything which was a pair or anything what fitted you. So sometimes you had a winter coat in the summer, or you could have had a night dress in the winter. I don't know how people could do this, to other human beings. That is still incomprehensible. And then we were herded into the barrack, and that was, as I say, the women barracks were much, much worse than the men barracks. The women barracks, they were just long barracks with, on both sides, again, you might have seen pictures, 3 high bunks, wooden structures. There was nothing in it, no bedding, not a bit of straw, no pillow. And so we could go or very low or middle or very high climb up. And about 8 people had to sleep there, which was really the size for 4 people. And as I say, we had to lie like spoons, because there was not a room so that one lies this way or that way. And it happened very often that you woke up in the morning and the person next to you had died in the night.
When you got there, you were very thirsty, hungry and thirsty, but the thirst was overwhelming. And you had been warned not to drink the water, but you couldn't help yourself.
Yeah.
And what happened?
We were going to work one day, and I was really parched. It was very hot, and I saw a tap which was dripping, and I drank water. And a few days later, I got typhus. And that's, of course, an illness. When you are looked after, get medication, it's not that necessarily you die. But if you have nothing and you carry on to work and again, no water and no medication, you would die. So my mother decided she would take me to the hospital. Well, there was a barrack which was called the hospital, but inmates told us not to go there because nobody comes out alive there. But my mother thought, if she doesn't get any help, I probably will die anyway. So she took the chance, the risk to go there. And the next miracle happens. Before she's even in that barrack, it was just an ordinary low barrack. A woman comes out, and my mother and her looks at each other, and then they ran to each other and embraced. And it was her cousin from Prague who had been transported via Theresienstadt as well to Auschwitz. And her husband was a skin doctor, and he worked with Mengele, and he was able to get a good job to work in the hospital. And she was able to give me some medication. In the camp, when we saw people dying next to you in your bunk, when you saw how people, when they marched to work and they just missed a step and went a bit out of line, were killed, attacked by Alsatian dog and murdered, when you saw the starvation, when you woke up in your bunk and the person next to you was dead, you slept with a dead body next to you, the only thing what we could do was pray to God to stop those terrible, terrible things happening. And God wasn't there for us. So this was really, really difficult to keep your faith. So life went on. We had to really work very, very hard. The food we got in the morning was some kind of liquid in a little mug. In the evening we got a chunk of bread. That was all we ever got. So we were pretty starving, and it became winter. It was very, very cold, and my mother, like any mother would do, had very often given me a bit of her bread ration. And so once a week we went to a shower. Washing, forget about washing. We never ever had a chance to wash during the week. But once a week there was, we went to a shower. And we came out of the shower naked. And there stood this Mengele with some of the SS. And there was a selection taking place. So I marched through. All right, I went to the good side, and my mother followed me, and Mengele looked at her a bit longer than normal, and she had to turn around even, and then he said, other side, wrong side, meaning that with other 40 women from our Dutch transport, she was picked out to go to gas chamber. So I still tried to say goodbye to her, but the Nazi hit me with a gun over the back and separate. Not even that did they allow to say goodbye. And then those 40 naked women marched out, and I thought I'd lost my mother. Yeah, well, she was safe, but I didn't know this, of course. And then the Russians obviously were approaching. We didn't know this, but the Nazis became very nervous. Many, many left. Sometimes the camps were open because the guard had left. And I was walking around one evening trying to find some food or something. And some Dutch people from our transport came, and they said, "Eva, good that we see you. We have seen your mother." And I thought they just want to cheer me up, because they realized I was already very depressed and on the point of giving up. And they said, "No, really, really, she's there. She's actually with your cousin Minnie, and try to go there." So after several days, again the gates were open, and I knew this part of the camp, another was Seagate or whatever, and I was able to go there, and indeed my mother was there. So you can imagine how wonderful that was. She looked very, very bad. She was very weak. I had a big heavy coat, no underwear, nothing. And my mother said, "Well, you look okay, you're fine." And she opened the coat, and there was practically a skeleton under.
I want to conclude before we bring Rabbi Levertov out with something from your book. Because even though we've talked entirely about anti-Semitism, of course, and what's happened to our people, I know that that's not what it's all about for you. So let me quote you. "We need to learn to live with each other in harmony, to accept each other for who and what we are. We must learn the lesson that human differences actually enrich our lives. We should not be afraid of people who are different from us, but we need to embrace their faiths and ways of life so we can give our children and future generations a safer life to live. We all have to work at this, and I hope we can teach our following generations to have moral courage both to exercise tolerance as they grow up and also to speak up and stand up against intolerance, racial prejudice, and systematic discrimination when they see it." This is not only about our people, it's about everyone.
That's correct. Yes, yes. And we have still to learn a lot, I'm afraid. And as well, the other thing I'm very upset about is that I was a refugee. We haven't talked about everything. First in Belgium, where I suffered a lot. And, to leave your own country, where your whole family is living, where your family members, where you have school friends, it's very, very difficult. And many, many people become refugees. Those are the strong people. They have to leave their home country because it's destroyed or they have no possibility to make a living. And again, the countries don't want them. The borders are closed. Many, when the Russian built the Berlin Wall, there was outcry around the world. But now America wants to build a wall against the Mexican, and the Austrian have built a wall against people who are coming from Asia, Middle East, and things like that. This is atrocious. We have to help those people. I sometimes ask American. I sometimes ask American audiences, who is a Native American? Well, I think here we probably have a few raised, but in most states, nobody raises a hand. So, you know, you all come from European countries because your great-grandparents had bad conditions there. They wanted to start a new life in a new country. And look how much we have achieved here. So, you know, those refugees are good people. Unfortunately, it happens that amongst the thousands there are a few bad ones, and they really spoil it for the good ones. But we have to take that risk to take a few bad ones with the many, many millions of good ones who we can give a good new life.
Eva Schloss, you are an inspiration. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Here, come. Hold it. Hold it. Hold it. Eva, thank you so much. You've been such an inspiration. What an amazing story. What a positive person you are. Friday night at the synagogue, you lit the Shabbat candles, and it was a very touching moment for me to see you lighting those candles, not candles of memorial, but candles of light and inspiration for the future. So we have a set of special Santa Fe Shabbat candles, Nambe Shabbat candles, my daughter Cyril will present you with as a memory from Santa Fe.
Oh, wonderful. Beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Give you a hug. Lovely.
We will continue your legacy of bringing light and spirit to the world around us. We'll continue doing those mitzvot, and we won't let you down. Thank you for coming to Santa Fe.
Thank you. Thank you.
How did you deal with that trauma?
Well, it took many, many, many years, but one of the things why I wanted to survive was because I wanted a family, children, husband, you know, and enjoy life. And I think life has so much to offer that eventually I accepted this was a small part of my life actually. You know, when you are 90, you experience already a lot of things. So I'm now very happy and, you know, enjoy life and what I'm doing gives me a lot of satisfaction.